And welcome to Positive Thought Podcast. I'm your host, Nabeel. Happy to be joined today by Nadir. Nadir, how you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
No worries. I know these are very interesting times that we find ourselves living in. Something that is top of mind, obviously, is what's been happening south of the border with the unfortunate death and murder of George Floyd and the ensuing protests and the rallies, and just, the fact that people are now looking and demanding change. And I think for once there are some ears that are willing to listen. But it'd be interesting to talk about with you, Nadir. Just share with us a little bit about the scope of work that you do, and sort of some of your reflections on what's happening, and in terms of just understanding how implicit compliance to existing structures of racism, discrimination continues to perpetuate a flawed system that often marginalizes so many people. So just tell us a little bit, Nadir, about your working environment and sort of some of your reflections on how some of those implicit compliances has been externalized in people's behavior and actions.
Yeah, so one thing I will say before I start is the George Floyd murder, and I feel like you hear two different voices, even the ones who agree with the protest. One is that this protest is happening because of George Floyd, and no, he was the breaking point. He is one of a list of many, and that's the black voices are saying, that it's, they're honoring George Floyd, but not just George Floyd. And some people think it's just that action, and let's just, once we settle this and the cops get charged, we'll be okay. And we won't. We need to make an institutional change. And I guess the way it starts is by self-reflection, looking at what have you done to participate in the system that in itself is corrupt and broken right now. So certain examples, like you said, people have implicit compliance. So I work at a retail space, right? The way I look at it is, if I go to a retail space, especially in not a majority minority area neighborhood, you don't go to a store. Maybe you'll see one black person, maybe you'll see two black people. So the scenario I always come up with is, you're looking at, say a store has 6 sales reps. They're designed, they have targets, and all 6 are white. Now one of them quits, and you interview people, and the best candidate's a black person. You're not racist, so you're like, you know what? This person did really well. I'm hiring this person. Now, second person quits. So now you do the interviews again, and now again, the best candidate is the black person. So you're like, this is good. Be a little bit wary, but you know what? I'll do it. Hire this. Now what happens when the third white person quits? Are you going to hire the third black person? Because you will recognize, and everyone recognizes, that people and their own biases will essentially hold themselves back from purchasing. They'll be more intimidated to go up to the sales rep. The sales will decline. So in order to preserve, your store, your revenue, you won't hire that third black person. You don't want that impression. And some people, and these are the non-racist ones. The racist ones will be like, I don't want a certain crowd to come into my store. Because say black people come in, they think it devalues their brand. Those are the overt racists. But the ones that are complicit are the ones that are like, hey, they're not racist. They will give that person a job. But they also, I do need to make sales. So now what are you doing? You're participating. This is where you have a compliance with the system. You have to be able to say no. I will give equal opportunity to everyone, and if society deems it inappropriate, then they need to change their ways, because this is our operating model. We are going to be equal opportunity. We say that word all the time, but we don't give equal opportunity. We have a quota, an unwritten quota.
Yeah, I think it is so true when we look and reflect as a society, right? We live within a context in which people are marginalized. And oftentimes we are outraged at what is overt and what is overtly discriminatory. but it's the microaggressions, right? To your point, it's the competing interest and conflict, right? Is it about profitability, or is it about sustainability, or is it about human dignity? And not just human dignity for a certain demographic of people, a certain race, a certain color, or a certain socioeconomic status, right? Like, human dignity is something that needs to be applied to all. And it should tell us a little bit about what is the state of our society when you have to make the decision between hiring somebody who is qualified, who happens to be black or a person of color, and the impression that you might give off to the people that you are serving, to your client base, to your customer base. I think that is what people are no longer willing to accept. And how much of that is entrenched in our social conventions. I'm wondering, Nadir, what are your thoughts when it comes to social conventions, and just how are people able to come to this realization that they are participating based on how society has continued to exist? But just because society has continued to exist that way, what role is convention playing, either perpetuating it, and what can we do to break it?
See, here's the thing about social conventions. It can be wonderful, here in Canada, it's just nice when you're walking, you hold the door open when you see someone's close to you. Those are all just the little things we do that make it really pleasant. But then there's a dark side to it. The dark side is basically we don't say it out loud, but you know what? Like I said, you don't hire that third black person, or the cops themselves, they recognize that, hey, the black neighborhoods need a little bit more patrolling, not recognizing why that neighborhood is in distress. They just recognize that this is a neighborhood I need to patrol, and these are the people I need to watch out for. And in terms of conventions, it's something as simple as making someone feel like less than themselves. So in a society, a black person will inherently feel like he could come off as threatening to a person when he's not a threatening person. So he will change his behavior to accommodate someone. He will inherently soften himself, or he will do things that are perceived as weak just so he doesn't come off as a violent person to you, even though he's not a violent person. Conventions tend to have positive impacts, but it can have some grave negative systemic impacts as well.
Right, and I think you were sharing earlier a story about a teenager and their experience with the society at large. I think it would be very appropriate for you to share that story and sort of how, who is doing the accommodation, who is being marginalized. And I think the story that you shared with me, which is a real story, really brings that to light. So we'd be really happy to hear that.
Yeah, so in university, there was an article I read, and so basically it goes, this black teenager, he was caught selling bootleg DVDs. Then a social worker came up and said, look, you have to change your ways or you're going to go to jail. So how about you get a part-time job? So he goes, no problem, I do want to change my ways. I don't want to live like this. So he goes, sends his resumes, and he finally gets a call at a restaurant. So he's all excited. He tells her, I have an interview, I'm preparing. They prepared together. And what she didn't tell him is she showed up early in the restaurant and she was hiding and watching him. So as he walks in, he meets a white lady. She's the manager. So he didn't shake her hand. He's like looking down, giving short answers. So obviously he didn't give a good interview and he didn't get the job. So now the social worker, she goes up to him and goes, hey, what's going on? Did you not want the job? He goes like, no, I really wanted it. She's like, it didn't seem like you wanted it. He's like, what do you mean? He's like, well, you didn't do all of these things. He goes, well, I didn't reach for her because like when I'm walking down the street, I see a white woman and she clenches her purse. So I didn't want to come off as intimidating. I didn't want to reach and scare her. I didn't make eye contact because, some people think that that's, I'm going to attack them or I'm angry with them if I'm making direct eye contact. So I tried to avoid that. And I tried to keep my answers short and be as soft-spoken as I can because, again, I don't want to come off as a threatening figure. And that's the sad part. The sad part is that we have a society where an entire race of people who are not actually violent or aggressive, and they know they're not violent or aggressive, but then they feel that way, that society's judging them this way, and they walk through it. They walk through like, I don't know what it feels like. I'm not speaking on their experience. I'm just saying that is, if I were to go through life trying to explain to people, hey, look, I'm a nice guy. Trust me, and I know the initial impressions. Yeah, I would feel terrible. I do give respect to the people who can still, go through life with a positive attitude, even though this is what they've been through. But they shouldn't have to go through that. I shouldn't be congratulating someone based on that. I shouldn't be knowing someone experienced that. That's not a society. That's not freedom. That's freedom for a few.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. And for somebody to constantly have to prove themselves, think about the doubt. If I was in that position, I can't even imagine. But the doubt that might exist in myself, right? The self-doubt that it's instilled based on how others are perceiving you. And we know how much labeling impacts a person's perception of self. And when you hear individuals who simply say, we need to take accountability, every individual needs to take accountability. That is so very true. But when do we as a society start taking accountability for holding on to these unconscious biases, sometimes implicitly participating in a system that perpetuates that 16-year-old kid, because that 16-year-old kid is trying to accommodate the perception that people have about him. I'm sure, many people walking around might clench their purse when they see somebody of color, walking close to them. Maybe they don't even do it knowingly. Maybe it's an unconscious response to a core belief of that bias. But think about the impact that it's having on a person of color, on a black youth. And then that experience, does that experience go away? Does that experience just erase somebody's from their memory? That becomes part of their lived experience. How can somebody feel like they belong in this society when the experiences they have almost explicitly excludes them, has this place and situation in which you will have that individual exist, right? So they exist in a space in which the choices they might have as a result of our own implicit compliance, our own unconscious bias, limits that choice for that individual. Even when they want and they put the effort forward and they have the skill set, the choices are just not there. And I think it never externalizes itself. It never manifests itself. These latent unconscious biases never manifest themselves more so than when we see the experiences of people of color, and in particular, young black males with the legal system, with the criminal justice system, with police. So I know you've had some, thoughts now there on just how the police have been treating people of color. I would love for you to share some of that with us.
Yeah, so the number one thing that I find, and the most telling thing that I find, because now we're not dealing with the more radical murders that happen way too often and way too many, but the threat of that. So when you look at the incident with Amy Cooper, she saw a black man telling her to obey the law, and she was furious. Who knows obviously race had something to play with it, but we can't guarantee. So let's say for a fact that race didn't have something to play with it. But what did have something to play with it? She used the cops and his race. So she threatened a man with a cop based on his race. She could have, if you're being threatened, you would say, hey, look, this man or this woman is threatening my life. When you specify and you tell that person, I'm going to specify that an African American man is threatening my life, now you are placing an implicit bias in the cop's head saying, you should come armed, you should come dangerous. And she knows that. And she participated in that and by all accounts, it's not an incident where she feared for her life. Because if she did, she would not be specifying it's an African American. That word is irrelevant when you're being threatened. What is relevant is a person is threatening me. The threat belongs with the other human being.
Yeah, that's true.
And so the whole idea is now, but why are the cops like that? Why do the cops participate? Because even the George Floyd's death, you have an Asian man. I believe one of them was mixed race. Mm-hmm. And why are they complicit in this? Why is it that the police system is in a way, because people keep saying few bad apples. It's not a few bad apples, because in New York, when they had stop and frisk, Mayor Bloomberg did stop and frisk. Around over 90% of the stops were on the minorities. So the way I look at it is either the few bad apples are doing all the work for the police and the good apples are doing nothing, or majority of them are participating in a system where they discriminate. Maybe some are more violent towards them than others, but they still participate. And you're looking at a legal system that punishes black males at a stricter punishment. They go to jail for longer. They get convicted at a higher rate. The precedent needed for evidence is lower for a black person. Sometimes all it takes is an accusation. You can go back to Emmett Till, where it was an accusation. You can go back to the Central Park 5, where all it was an accusation, and that's all it takes. But then you look at that 19, 20-year-old white kid who was super rich. He raped a woman behind a dumpster while people watched, and he admitted to it, and he got 6 months in jail. And when they asked the judge, how could you give him that? He said, oh, he's a rich person. 6 months is a little too harsh. That is the problem.
Yeah, isn't that so telling? And I think when you're talking about the police system, I want to share something that the police are supposed to be our heroes, right? Anybody who puts on the police badge, I'm sure people who want to be police officers do so because they care about the community, they want to protect the community, they want to keep the community safe. They're willing to put their life on the line to keep the community safe. I respect that and I appreciate that, and I truly believe that police officers are the true heroes in our everyday lives, right? But when you, as a police officer, have to ask yourself, are we killing more people innocently than we're protecting? Are we participating in a society that marginalizes people based on their skin color, based on their ethnicity, based on their socioeconomic status? And am I complying to perpetuate that system further? Am I truly the hero that everybody thinks I am? Am I the hero that I went out to be? Am I protecting the people that I'm supposed to protect, or am I killing them without justification and just through the implicit biases, the explicit unconscious biases that we hold on to ourselves, and then we feel threatened by things that are not threatening at all, right? That requires inner reflection. I think as police, as any institution that has power and that has privilege, we need to use that power and that privilege for good. We need to use that power and that privilege to make changes that allows everybody in society to participate, that allows people in society to have access, and that allows people in society to feel safe. And I know we've been talking a lot about what's happening in south of the border, but even in Canada, racism exists. Black youth, young black males are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, in the penitentiary system. Aboriginal, Indigenous peoples in Canada make up less than 4% of the population, but they're close to 25% of the penitentiary residents in those jails. Think about that. We are not free from the same marginalization, the same critique that we're offering to our neighbors down south. We have those very same challenges that exist within our own country, within our own communities. And I think at this point, I don't think this is a choice anymore. I'm speaking as a person of color who has, every time I'm a Muslim brown man, every time I go to fly somewhere, and this is not an exaggeration by any means of the imagination, I don't have those, self-check-ins. They don't apply to me. I have to go and I have to explain to the individual where I'm flying to, and they often have to make 2 or 3 phone calls before I am allowed to board. And guess what? It always happens. And you know what? It's because my name sounds familiar or is similar to somebody else that they're really looking for, right? If I continue to accept that as my reality, then you know what? Maybe somebody who doesn't have access to the same resources as me, as the same privilege as I do, might necessarily not have the same outcome as me. They might end up with contact with the criminal justice system. Think about the belonging that person experiences. So speaking from my lens as a person of color, I can speak to the injustice, the systemic marginalization that exists. Now, if you're somebody who's an Indigenous person in Canada, or a black, somebody from the black community in Canada or in the States, think about how much more turbulent your experience is just simply because of the color of your skin. How honestly is that acceptable? If this is all to mean something, if we are speaking about discrimination, speaking about racism, I think to Nadir's point, We don't have to be overtly racist, but we are implicitly compliant. And that is really where we need to make change. Any last words, Nadir, before we wrap it up?
Yeah. I just wanted to say it's about dignity at the end of the day. It's about living a life with a level of respect that is owed to the majority that the minority does not have. And it's funny, the darker your skin, the less respect you get and the less dignity you have, because people aren't willing to give you that. And those dignities aren't the bigger picture ones. It's the little things you do in life. It's the ones where, if you go to a restaurant, the tables are always full. If you want to call a cab, they just seem to not be taking any rides anymore. It's the little things where you feel that you are different, even though you're a citizen, even though you've lived in this country, your grandfathers, your forefathers have lived in this country. However, you feel like you're an outsider trying to belong. You're that new kid on the block. You have something to prove, yet no one else does. And that's where you're robbing them of that dignity. And they deserve it. They deserve that respect. And everybody does. And I think everyone should be, if we're functioning in a society, then we need to function together. Otherwise, separate it and don't call yourself a democracy. Call yourself what it is.
That's very true. I think those are words that we need to reflect on. Those are words that we need to use to make change. And there's no room left for excuses. If we're all in this together truly, then we have to make the changes that we know exist. And sometimes, when you reflect from within and you recognize those implicit biases, the lack of respect and human dignity that is afforded to people based on their color of their skin, based on their ethnicity, based on, factors like that, I think, it's not about judgment and it's not about blame, but it's about ownership and accountability. Because if we're not willing to look from within and take ownership and take accountability of our own biases, then we will perpetuate a system that continues to marginalize people. Thank you so much, Nadir, for joining today at the Positive Thought podcast. Until next time, everybody, stay safe. Peace out.